Montana PBS presents the Montana Newspaper Association Candidate Debates, the 2014 Race for the U.S. Senate. Support for this program provided by the Greater Montana Foundation, encouraging communications on issues, trends, and values of importance to Montanans, and the Montana Newspaper Foundation. From the Library Auditorium on the campus of Montana Tech in Butte, here is moderator Tom Egensberger.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to one of two debates featuring Montana's U.S. Senate and U.S. House candidates. I'm Tom Egensberger of the Montana Newspaper Association, which is jointly bringing you these debates with Montana PBS. I will serve as your moderator today. Up first are the U.S. Senate candidates, and we're going to go right to work. Senator John Walsh was born and raised in Butte and attended Carroll College. He worked his way up to be the Adjutant General of the Montana National Guard. In 2012, he was elected Lieutenant Governor of Montana and then selected as one of Montana's U.S. Senators with the retirement of Senator Max Baucus. Congressman Steve DAINES is from Bozeman and a graduate of Montana State University. After a career with Procter & Gamble, he returned to Bozeman to join Right Now Technologies, the largest commercial employer in Bozeman. He rose to the office of Vice President there and was elected successfully to Congress in 2012. Roger Roots of Livingston attended Eastern Montana College. He holds a Juris Doctorate degree and a PhD and now is teaching at Jarvis Christian College in Hawkins, Texas. Questions for the candidates will be posed by a panel of Montana media journalists. Anna Rao is an investigative journalist at Montana PBS. Frank Mealy is the managing editor of the Kalispell Daily Interlake, and Mike Dennison is in the Lee Newspaper State Bureau in Helena. And we'll get started. Panelist Rao, your first question.
Good afternoon, Senator Walsh. Earmarks have been extremely controversial in the past, and Congress has had a ban on them since 2010. However, before the ban, Montana was one of the top 10 states receiving earmark money for various projects, including wastewater treatment facilities, hospitals, and public transportation. Would you support a continued ban on earmarks? And if so, how would you secure funding for what you considered worthy projects for the state?
Well, Anna, thank you very much for this question. You know, today is a very special day. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to thank Montana Tech for allowing us to hold this in this facility. And when I say a special day, you know, today is Flag Day, and it's also the 239th birthday of the United States Army. So all you Army veterans out there, congratulations. I know this may be a little out of protocol, but one thing that we do quite a bit in the military, especially on a day like today, is we pay tribute to the flag of the United States of America. So if I could I have everybody please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance? I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much. Now, Anna, to your question. You know, earmarks have been very good for the state of Montana. As I was coming up through the Montana National Guard, I recall Conrad Burns and other senators, Senator Max Baucus. We have numerous facilities around the state that we can attribute to earmarks. So I think that there is a place for earmarks in the Congress. I think it allowed representatives, senators and representatives to work together, to work on some projects, to bring funding back to the states. You know, right now, those states, especially in the Congress that have the majority, the large number of representatives, have an ability to stop
Senator Walsh,
funding from coming in the state of Montana.
Next, Congressman Daines, same question.
Yeah, thank you. Well, since I've been back in Congress for the last 18 months, I've recognized one thing for certain: Washington, D.C. is broken. There's a lack of transparency in Washington. career politicians put their own self-interest ahead of doing the right thing for the people. And the earmark process was getting abused, as you had a bunch of crony political relationships there that were abusing the earmark process. And consequently, we had to bring more transparency to the process. But one thing I know is that Montana always comes first for me. So as I worked through this process, like we just put through the WRDA bill in Congress, we were able to prioritize our projects for Montana. Montana's voice was heard to ensure that we fund these important projects for a great state. And you can do that without having to have the earmark process.
Mr. Roots, same question?
I take the Ron Paul position on earmarks. For years, Ron Paul was a congressman from a particular district in Texas. He was all for budget cutting, budget cutting, budget cutting. He was against pork barrel spending of all kinds. But he occasionally would submit an earmark for his district. Okay, and he would occasionally be criticized for that. He would often point out that, in fact, what's the alternative to earmarks? You give the executive branch carte blanche to do as it chooses with that budget. Now, those budgets are way too high. I agree with Mr. Daines. It's broken in Washington. We've got to slash those budgets, get them lower, but there's nothing wrong with earmarks. Remember, an earmark would be a way to give an order to the executive branch that the executive branch has to follow. What's the alternative? You let the executive branch do whatever it wants to do. So the president then would just take the same amount of money. Remember, it doesn't change the money at all. An earmark does not change the money that is spent at all. But it actually gives an order to the executive branch, and it binds the executive branch. So I don't have a problem with earmarks. I take the Ron Paul position. Thank you.
Senator Walsh, do you have a response?
Well, again, I think that earmarks have played an important role in providing funding to the states. I think they're appropriate, but they have to have oversight and transparency. Washington is broken. Washington has a spending problem. Our Congressman Steve Daines, is a part of the problem. He's been in Washington, D.C. for his first term. He's already shut down the government, cost the state of Montana over $45 million. So that's had a negative impact on what's happening in Washington, D.C. right now. So we need to be able to come together, up with solutions, and solve the problems for the states.
Congressman Daines, do you have a response?
Sure. Well, I serve in the United States House of Representatives. It is the House of the people. And that's why it's important as we go through the budgeting process, the voice of the people is heard in Congress. And that is why Congress ultimately has the responsibilities in the purse strings and on budgets. We do not want to delegate that to the President of the United States, as he's shown his abuses of power. We need to make sure that we serve the people. The House is the voice of the people. And that is why it's important as we go through budgets and so forth that we first pass budgets. The Senate has not passed a budget this year. And it's important, too, that we stand up for the people we represent.
Mr. Roots, you have 60 seconds.
Again, the main focus shouldn't be so much on earmarks specifically. It's on the spending, the reckless and irresponsible spending of these two government supremacist parties. Both of these men on stage spend like drunken sailors. Some people say that it's an insult to drunken sailors, because at least drunken sailors are spending their own money. These two gentlemen are spending the American people's money. The focus should be on cutting these budgets, and by the way, both of them might spin a tale like they're for balancing budgets and things. Look at their votes. They grow government spending whenever they get a chance. Mr. Daines grew government spending. We sent him to Washington to cut. He didn't cut. We sent Walsh to Washington to cut. He hasn't cut one dime. All he does is grow government.
The next question comes from Frank Mealy.
This will be something of a follow-up to that discussion. Representative Daines, the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution in large measure to limit the power of the federal government. Yet, as we've heard, federal bureaucracies and spending relentlessly proliferate, regardless of the party in power in Washington. Do you think federal government is out of control, or do you intend to support expanding federal spending and programs, as other Republicans have done? What serious measures can Congress pursue to halt or reverse this trend short of a government shutdown? And how do you get the people on your side when it comes to not raising the debt ceiling?
Washington, D.C. is out of control. Spending is out of control. And it's very important, if we're going to grow jobs in our state and grow jobs in our country, we're going to have to limit the size of government. So we need more jobs and we need less government. One of the first bills I introduced to the floor of the House when I was newly elected was called the Balanced Budget Accountability Act. And I spent 28 years in the private sector. And when in the private sector, you get paid for results. And what this bill says is simply this. if we don't balance the budget, Congress should not get paid. And I think we need to hold Congress accountable to results. I also support an amendment to the Constitution for a balanced budget. And I think the American people should know, and Montana should know, the United States Senate did not pass a budget for 5 years up until a year ago when we said if you don't pass a budget, you're not going to get paid. It was called the No Budget, No Pay Law. And finally, the Senate produced a budget for the first time since the iPad had been invented. The House passed a budget this year. The Senate is refusing to pass a budget this year. The first step in terms of achieving a balanced budget is to first pass one and then pass one that balances.
Could I remind the audience to hold your applause, please? Mr. Roots, your question?
With regard to Mr. Daines' claim that he's for balancing the budget. Listen, I'm for balancing the budget. And by the way, I would be for a balanced budget amendment. It has to take into consideration the problem of central banking and the Federal Reserve Bank, because they can just churn out money to balance the budget. The key is to get spending down. Now, Mr. Daines developed a record in Congress. He was only there for 2 years. And I ask any of you in the audience, count up the votes that he cast. I count up that he added hundreds of billions of dollars in additional spending that he placed on our shoulders. And now he comes and says he's for balancing the budget. Well, he didn't do that in the 2 years that he was there. He didn't spend in accordance to a balanced budget. So I think that, that's the real problem. You can say you're for a balanced budget, but both of these gentlemen spent more than the government brought in. So they didn't balance the budget when they had the chance to cast votes. By the way, you talked about a shutdown. I will never, ever vote to raise the debt ceiling, never under any circumstances. And if it comes to some kind of a crucial point where the administration is threatening horrible things, shutting down the government, understand, shut it down. The screams of those in government will be a symphony to my ears. I will keep government shut down until we get those budgets cut.
Senator Walsh, your answer?
Yes, Washington does have a spending problem. Since I was sworn into the United States Senate, I've introduced legislation to cut our budget. I've introduced a balanced budget amendment. I've introduced legislation that would not allow the Congress to come home on these one-week recesses every 2 weeks until they pass the budget. I've also introduced what I call the Cuts Act. I've spent 33 years working for the Department of Military Affairs and the Department of Defense. Next year's defense budget is going to be approximately $596 billion. That's more than the next 10 countries combined spend on defense. So I know that there are areas within the Department of Defense that we can cut spending and still maintain our national security presence. What the Cuts Act will do, since 2002, we've spent over $2 trillion on contract services within the Department of Defense, which has taken jobs away from men and women who wear the uniform and provided those jobs to contractors. Contractors making twice as much in many cases as a service member who was performing those duties. Congressman Daines talks about, again, cutting the budget, but he shut down the government. What that actually did was raise the debt in the budget. So we have to get a handle on spending, but we have to do it responsibly. We can't do it on the backs of our most vulnerable citizens. Congressman Daines also wants to privatize Medicare, shifting those costs onto the back of our most vulnerable citizens. In my opinion, that's wrong.
Congressman Daines, your response?
When they asked Admiral Mullen what's one of the greatest threats to our national security served on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he said the national debt. We face a national debt now of nearly $18 trillion. We simply must start to limit the size of government. If we want to grow jobs, we want to have more jobs as the economy, it's going to mean we're going to have less government. And that's why it's so important that we've got to put measures in place, balanced budget amendment to the Constitution, as well as pass my bill that says if Congress refuses to balance the budget, then they shouldn't get paid. But it starts with the United States Senate. They need to even pass a budget. The Senate does not even have the courage to come forward and pass a budget this year. They punted on it.
Mr. Roots, your response?
In terms of Mr. Daines', again, his hawkishness in claiming to be interested in balancing the budget. All you have to look at is what these people do when they're actually casting a vote. We used to have a congressman named Rayburg. 10 years we sent him to Washington. He would promise to cut government. He would promise to cut government. He would do the same things as Mr. Daines did in just 2 years. For 10 years, he would come back to Montana in his cowboy boots and say he was for limited government. Then he'd go back to Washington and vote to grow government. Mr. Daines voted for an $800 billion farm bill. That's just one example of the things that he voted for, right on our shoulders. And any of you who think the farm bill is for farmers, I'd love to have a conversation with you. It's for farmers in other countries. They pay farmers not to grow crops in other countries to support our different farm lobbies here. But there is no fiscal restraint from these two government supremacist parties. They just constantly vote to grow government and spend, spend, spend. Thank you.
Senator Walsh.
You know, it is going to take courage to do what we have to do in Washington, D.C., to cut our spending, to get us back on the right track. And Congressman Daines, again, has proven that he doesn't have the courage to do what's right. Congressman Daines will talk about how important it is to create jobs here in America, create jobs in Montana. Congressman Daines spent about 6 or 7 years in China working for a company who was shutting down factories here in the United States while Congressman Daines was in China hiring those same jobs. The Secretary of Labor went to China to talk with Congressman Daines to see about those jobs. And the Secretary came back and felt that those same jobs that were being created in China, or the factory stood up in China and the jobs being created, could be created here. So it's one thing to talk about creating jobs here in the United States and doing it, but it's another thing to actually put those words into action.
The next question comes from Mike Dennison and goes to Mr. Roots.
Good afternoon, Mr. Roots. One of your candidates here, fellow candidates here, has questioned whether you should even be here today or at future debates because of racist views that you've written and disseminated in the past. What do you think of that stance, and what are voters to think of your prior race-related writings and comments?
Well, let me just say that it is true. I used to call myself a right-winger. I used to be a racist. I used to subscribe to such opinions in my teens and 20s. I am a high school dropout. I hitchhiked across the country 5 times before I was 20 years old. I've educated myself over the years. I now have a PhD in sociology. I actually teach race relations at the college level. I teach race relations at the college level at a historically black college. I have a law degree. I have a master's degree. I believe I'm probably the most educated person. I'm a high school dropout, ironically. In this auditorium, if anyone has more advanced degrees than I have, I'd love to meet you. I rarely meet anyone with 3 advanced degrees. The point is, listen, I've written many letters of recommendation for my African American students. I do all I can for people of all races and colors and things. It is these parties, by the way, it is these 2 parties that promote this redistribution philosophy, which is very similar to the philosophy of the hate groups. It's the same exact philosophy, taking resources from Group A and giving them to Group B. The Ku Klux Klan, the Democratic Party, they do the same thing. The only thing that differs is who Group A and Group B is.
Senator Walsh, your answer?
Well, I honestly believe that all the candidates who are going to appear on the ballot should have the opportunity to present their views. You know, these are important times. We have an election coming up in November, and the citizens of Montana are going to have the opportunity to vote on who their next United States Senator will be. And so these debates provide that opportunity for the candidates to express their views, and so I believe that it's appropriate for all the candidates to appear at these debates. But what is really important right now is that we talk about what's wrong with Washington, D.C. You know, Washington has a spending problem. We've been talking about it for the past couple of questions. But we really do have a spending problem. And how are we going to solve these spending problems? You know, Congressman Daines wants to do it on the backs of our most vulnerable citizens. He wants to privatize Medicare. He wants to continue to give tax breaks to corporations to send jobs overseas. We want to create jobs here in Montana. We want to create jobs here in America. That's what's important, because if we are able to create jobs here in the state of Montana, that's what's going to get our economy moving and continue to keep it moving forward. Small businesses will continue to grow. Montanans will have more money in their pockets to spend in those businesses. That's what's going to create jobs in this country. That's what's going to create revenue, and that's what's going to keep this country moving forward.
Mr. Roots, do you have a response?
I don't really have a response to what he just said. No, thank you.
Oh, excuse me, Congressman Daines, I apologize.
No, that's fine.
My
Thank
fault.
you. Well, we need to stay focused today on the most important issues facing our country. We need more jobs. We need less government. As I travel all across this state, I find that our three greatest exports are our cattle, our grain, and our children. Yet our children are probably our greatest natural resource. We need to create more opportunities so Cindy and I, as parents of 4 children, that our kids will find opportunities they can stay here. The best compliment I ever had working for Right Now Technologies in Bozeman, after we created hundreds of jobs there, they were Montana kids working in Bozeman, is when a grandmother said, "I'm grateful that I don't have to travel to New York or Florida or California to see my grandkids. I can come to Bozeman." And that's what we need to do. And we will do that by reining in the size of government. Traveling across the state, everywhere I hear about the overreach of the federal government, the expanding regulations. And it's time that we put an end to this overreach of this president, these federal bureaucracies that are creating great uncertainty for men and women in Montana who are fighting hard every day to grow their business. They want to have DC stay out of their lives and let us in Montana here run our lives and grow our businesses and raise our families.
And now, Mr. Roots, you can have a response.
Back to the topic of racism and white supremacy and such things. You don't have to travel very far in Montana to find out what a white supremacist government might look like. Just go to one of the federal courthouses here in the state of Montana. After you go through the East Berlin checkpoints, you can sit in the audience during a day when they're processing criminal cases and look at the criminal defendants in that federal courthouse. Remember, Montana is, 90% white? Not so among the federal defendants that you'll see in federal court in Montana. Disproportionately Native American, probably 50%, 60% Native American. Of course, there's a lot of federal jurisdiction on those reservations. It's also disproportionately black and Hispanic. You can sit and you'll watch these strings of Native Americans come in chains, and they all, they're not even allowed to shower except before trial, which never happens. Trials never occur. Everybody has to plead guilty. It's just a spectacle of humiliation of the American people that these parties love to participate in.
Senator Walsh, your response?
This past week we had a wonderful opportunity to keep our greatest natural resource here in the state of Montana. That is, our young men and women who are graduating from colleges. Today, they are graduating from college with somewhere around an average of $27,000 in debt. The Senate put up legislation to reduce the interest rate that was being charged on those student loans from about 8% down to 4% and lower. But that bill was blocked because it would have taken away tax loopholes from millionaires like Congressman Daines and his friends and those large businesses who send jobs overseas. We talk about wanting to keep our greatest natural resource here in Montana and in other states, but then when we have an opportunity to do it, we don't take that appropriate action in Washington, D.C. So again, Washington has to quit making everything political and get to work.
Congressman Daines, your response?
I'm the only job creator standing on the stage today running for the United States Senate. I've been out there working hard to create those opportunities and seeing that success so that more Montana kids could stay here and not have to leave our great state. And I'm grateful for that track record and hope we can continue to grow more businesses here in Montana so that our kids, these wonderful resources we have, can be educated in Montana and choose to stay here because there are career opportunities for them to not only stay here but grow their families and have a career.
The next question comes from Frank Mealy, and it goes to Senator Walsh.
Senator Walsh, how do you plan to represent the state's interests when it comes to coal, timber, and oil extraction when so many special interest groups affiliated with the Democratic Party are opposed to coal, oil, and timber extraction? Specifically, and to narrow it for all the candidates, Do you believe in man-caused climate change, and what do you think about the federal government's measures to counteract it? And considering that Montana has the largest coal reserves in the nation, how do you feel about the new EPA regulations targeting coal energy, and what would you do to challenge your own party to fight those regulations?
Frank, could you repeat the second part of that question? Just kidding. Frank, I was born in Butte, Montana, right down here on Locust Street, about 6 blocks from the Berkeley pit. My father worked for the Anaconda Company, and so I understand natural resource development and the impacts of natural resource development. The one thing I will tell you that I will not do is that I remember in the late 1970s when the Anaconda Company pulled out of Butte, Montana. I remember the families that were impacted by the Anaconda Company leaving Butte, Montana. I remember the impact of families from the Anaconda Company leaving Anaconda, Montana. So what's very important to me is jobs. Montana has a vast array of natural resources in this state, and we have to make sure that we are capturing and doing everything we can to create jobs in those industries, because we are going to have to rely on natural resources for many years to come. But I also want to make sure that Congress pulls its head out of the sand and understands what's going on here in the United States. You know, when I worked for the Montana National Guard, I served as a Plans, Operations, and Military Support Officer in the year of 2000, when over 1 million acres of Montana was on fire. As I drive around the state of Montana and I see the beetle kill trees and the effect that that's having on our forests, when I see the waters that are starting to warm, you know, there's a lot of jobs, not only in the natural resource industry, but that come along with agriculture, the timber industry, anglers, hunters. So we have to take a look at all of these industries and how we are going to create jobs. But I am not going to shut down any jobs based on what, you know, some
Your time
rules.
is up, Senator Walsh. Congressman Daines, your answer?
Recently, I was up in Lincoln County. Lincoln County is controlled 76% by the federal government and has an unemployment rate of over 15%. I had a conversation with a young couple there that night for dinner, and they said, Steve, basically what we have up here now is poverty with a view. As the timber industry has been decimated by extreme interests. When I was growing up in Montana, we used to have 30 active sawmills. Today, we have only 11. When I was growing up, timber harvests were 90% greater on our federal lands than they are today. If we lose our natural resource base in this state, we lose good, high-paying jobs. I was on the Crow Reservation recently and spoke with Chairman Darren Old Coyote. He said to me, a war on coal is a war on the Crow people of Montana. I spent time out in Coal Strip a week and a half ago, right after the president announced these regulations are going to kill the coal industry. And they were looking at me saying, what are we doing back in Washington here, allowing this president and these out-of-control regulations here to kill our natural resource industry, to kill our jobs? This is not just a war on coal. This is a war on the middle class in America, a war on jobs in Montana.
Mr. Roots, your answer?
With regard to the energy industry, I'm a big proponent of free markets, capitalism. I think that's the way to go with the oil industry, the coal industry. I often have great discussions about climate change and these kinds of things. I love reading up on this, all sides of these kinds of topics. I love science. I love reading up on it. Suffice it to say, what is the solution to any environmental concern, including the climate change idea? The solution is to unleash the power of capitalism on such an idea. Because every time you unleash the power of socialism, I shouldn't even say the power of socialism, the stink and stain of government supremacy, central planning, and socialism, you get more pollution, you get a degraded environment, you get dirtier air, you get dirtier water. When the Berlin Wall came down, which side was more polluted? Which side had cleaner air? The cleaner air was on the capitalist side. The cleaner rivers were on the capitalist side. The dirtier air, the dirtier, polluted environments were on the communist, the socially planned, the government-controlled side. The same is true in Korea. They split Korea in half just like they did with Germany. In Korea, you go there today, the capitalist side, remember, there are enemies of capitalism. There are enemies of capitalism right here in Montana who want it shut down, taxed, regulated, stopped. They would create a degraded environment like you wouldn't believe. Just look at North Korea.
Senator Walsh, your response?
You know, in a previous question, Congressman Daines stated that he was the only one on this stage that has created jobs. The question that I have for Congressman Daines is, where do you create the jobs? Do you create the jobs here in Montana, or do you create the jobs overseas? We want to create the jobs here in Montana. So that's what's very important that we take a look at. Again, talking about our natural resource development, we have an abundance of natural resources in the state of Montana. We have to make sure that we are balancing jobs with other, all across the state. I mentioned how important fishing is, and hunting, skiing, those industries are to the state of Montana. I visited Colstrip, Montana last week and talked about the jobs that they have there and the impact of these rules. So we are going to come up with Montana solution to developing these rules, but I will not support any rules that are going to take away jobs from Montanans.
Congressman Daines, your response?
Senator, John Walsh was in Billings recently at an anti-coal rally. There were some members from some of the unions there that saw him there embracing some of these extreme activists that seek to shut down the coal business. You can't have it both ways. And I can tell you, my conversation out in Colstrip 2 weeks ago was a very different conversation than the conversation that John had out there.
Okay. Mr. Roots, your response?
Back on climate change, you know, if we unleash the power of the individual, instead of the stink of government, the individual could solve any environmental problem. There would be people who would be tinkering in their backyards with little spacecrafts and things that they would send up into the stratosphere, clean the air. This is what capitalism does. It cleans things. It makes things better. Every measurement of human well-being improves where there are free markets. Look at North Korea. Look at Germany. Two countries where they had the same populations. They cut the countries in half. Half went capitalist, half went communist. The results were identical on each side. Each single time. Every measurement of human well-being improves when there is freedom and free markets.
The next question comes from Mike Dennison and goes to Congressman Daines.
Congressman Daines, welcome. I'm just wondering if you support raising the federal minimum wage to $10 an hour or at all. And if not, should there be any policy initiatives to address the growing wealth disparity in our country?
Every day when I wake up and have the privilege of serving the people of Montana in this job, I need to put Montana first. We do not need the federal government telling the state of Montana what our minimum wage should be. That should be a conversation we have here within the state of Montana. It should be a conversation that we should not have President Obama and Congress telling us what to do. The best answer is to move forward here with jobs that are in the $15, $20, $25 range, and that's in natural resources. We will create more jobs if we can get the government out of the way. These regulations that we see coming out of Washington, coming out of these bureaucratic agencies, are a direct threat right now to our timber industry, to our coal industry, and to our oil and natural gas. So it's important, if we're going to have an all-of-the-above energy policy, which I support, it needs to also include some of our traditional sources of energy, because by developing those, if you go out to eastern Montana, they're not having minimum wage conversations right now. They're having conversations about how can they continue to hire people to fill the jobs they currently have.
Mr. Roots, your answer?
The minimum wage idea is one of the dumbest ideas ever produced in the mind of the regulatory man. There's an R-squared coefficient. There are over 100 peer-reviewed studies in the economic literature that show that raising the minimum wage is correlated with higher unemployment rates. So when you raise the minimum wage, you get more people out of work. You also get inflation. And by the way, it disrupts the just basics, the fundamental laws of supply and demand. I used to have a professor down at UNLV named Hans Hermann Hoppe, one of the greatest minds I ever knew. Author of the book Democracy, the God That Failed. Great libertarian thinker and scholar. He used to say that anyone who supports the minimum wage is either stupid or evil. It's evil because it harms the poorest more than it harms anyone else. Anyone who claims they believe that the minimum wage doesn't, raising the minimum wage doesn't raise unemployment rates, anyone who claims they believe that, let me just tell you, it would be absolutely immoral of you if you honestly believe that it doesn't raise unemployment rates, why demand $10 an hour? It would be immoral of you not to demand $10,000 per hour minimum wage. Immoral, if you don't think that has an effect on unemployment rates.
Senator Walsh, your answer?
Well, I do support the raise of a minimum wage. You know, our hardworking families out there who are working 2 jobs and still making below the poverty level, that's wrong. And don't believe that it isn't happening. I live in Helena, Montana, the state capital of the state of Montana. My wife works at an elementary school where she sees young boys and girls coming into school every day where their parents work, both parents work, and they're making below poverty wages. What that level should be, I don't know yet, whether it's $10, $15, I don't know that. What I want to focus on is that Montanans are making a livable wage so that those hardworking families out there can make put food on the table, pay their bills, and not have to live in poverty. When we talk about bringing good quality jobs to the state of Montana, those are the type of jobs we need to make sure that we are bringing jobs that are going to pay a livable wage for the citizens of Montana. When we talk about that we should let the economy take care of this on its own, well, how come that hasn't happened in the last several years? When we talk about the experts there saying that thousands of jobs will be lost, there's no proof of that. The last few times that we've raised the minimum wage, we haven't lost thousands of jobs. So I support raising the minimum wage to a livable wage.
Congressman Daines, your response.
Well, I'll explain why this economy is not growing. It's because the government's growing too fast, and that is an impediment to growing this economy. But I'll tell you, every day when you show up for work, representing at the federal level, you have to make a decision. Do you stand with the people of Montana, or are you going to stand with the federal government, Barack Obama, the United States Senate? In this discussion of minimum wage, that is a Montana discussion. We don't need to have the people in New York or Florida or California telling us what the minimum wage should be in Montana. That's our discussion to have. So we should decide, because our minimum wage right now at $7.90 in Montana is already higher, the federal minimum wage. So we need to let this be a Montana discussion, and this principle is very, very important depending on who gets elected to serve in the United States Senate. Are you going to stand with Montana, or are you going to stand with Barack Obama?
Mr. Roots, your response.
Do U.S. senators set your wages? That's the question. I mean, it's that ridiculous. Wages are set by the law of supply and demand in the marketplace. Wouldn't it be great if we could just vote for politicians who would go to Washington and raise all of our wages? Wouldn't that be great? Wow! Of course, it's a joke. It's a mockery. It's a farce. The minimum wage is one of the stupidest ideas in the world. It disrupts the free market. The free market sets wages. Can you imagine 3 ugly guys in suits setting your wages for 300 million Americans from Washington, D.C.? It's that much of a joke.
Senator Walsh, your response?
You know, as a politician, it's easy to stand up here and talk about how we want to create more jobs, less government. But when you get put into the position, it's a little more difficult. You have to actually do something. You know, I was part of the Bullock-Walsh administration where we traveled around the state talking about how we were going to create more and better paying jobs as we were campaigning. Once we were elected, we had to actually do something. We put a program in place. It took us approximately a year, traveling around the state, to put a jobs program in place. Since over the past year, the state of Montana has created over 10,000 jobs. So we are doing something right here in the state of Montana to create more and better paying jobs. And we need to continue down that track. But we need to make sure that these jobs that we are creating are livable wage jobs so that the hardworking Montanans can put food on the table, can buy clothes for their children, so that their children don't have to rely on free and reduced lunches when they go to school. That's what's important to me.
The next question comes from Anna Rao, and it goes to Mr. Roots.
Speaking of wages and pay, Mr. Roots, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, women earn on average 70 cents for every dollar men earn. Studies have shown that occupation choice and education do explain some of this gap, but not all of it. About a third of that remains. The Paycheck Fairness Act, introduced in the Senate in April, seeks to correct this pay gap, but has failed to gain much traction. Do you believe a pay gap exists? And if so, what would you do about it? A
pay gap does not exist. You said that, you know, when you factor in, I forget the two factors that you factored in, that those...
Occupation and education level.
Occupation and education. Remember, men and women don't seek the same choices in college. Right here at Montana Tech, it's disproportionately males who seek careers and degrees in mining engineering. Those are very well-paying jobs, okay? Disproportionately males go through those kinds of programs, architecture, engineering, those kinds of degrees, and they are more valuable on the marketplace. So she's absolutely right. That explains a good portion of the so-called gap between men and women. By the way, when you look at other factors, she didn't mention there are other factors. There's probably 20 factors. When you factor in every single one of them, women, for example, tend to seek jobs with more job security. Males will tend to take more jobs that are riskier, more dangerous, more physically dangerous to their health, for example. There is no gap between male and female wages. By the way, if there was a gap, you could make millions. A greedy capitalist could make millions just hiring more women and paying them less. Just think of how much money he could make. There is no gap. It doesn't exist.
Senator Walsh, your answer.
Well, I would disagree with Roger. I believe a pay gap does exist, and I do support the Paycheck Fairness Act because I believe that a woman and a man doing the same job should make the same wage. You know, I just had a granddaughter turn 1 year old, and I want to make sure that she has the same rights that her, you know, when she gets into the workforce, that the man working next to her has. So I'm going to continue to fight to make sure that women receive the same benefits, the same pay that a man does for doing the same type of work, because equality is very important to me, and I will continue to fight on their behalf.
Congressman Daines, your answer.
Well, I think about that question viewing it through the lens of a father. We have 4 children, 2 sons and 2 daughters. And I'm the proud father of a recent graduate from Montana State University, my daughter Annie. And I tell you what, I want Annie making more than that guy that she might be working next to if she's got better skills and more experience. So I think it's very, very important here that we continue to fight for insurance, that we have fairness in the marketplace. But I want her to be making more because I'm a pretty proud dad, and she's a very experienced and skilled young lady as she's starting her career in public education. But it really begs another question, and that really is, how are we going to create more job opportunities ultimately here in Montana so that when our students graduate from our universities, when our young people graduate from trade schools, when they're leaving high school, ready to start in the workplace, we need to have a place for them to create a high-paying job here in Montana instead of sending them all over the country. So it really starts with more jobs, and that we accomplish that by pushing back on the growth of government.
Mr. Roots, your response.
A couple of economists that I will cite with regard to this question. One is named Thomas DeLorenzo, and the other is Walter Block. Both have done extensive economic research into this question of whether or not women and men really are paid, whether or not there is this gap and women are only paid 77 cents for whatever a man makes. And they find that when you factor in all of these things, and there's about 20 different factors, the gap disappears. It doesn't exist. And again, if it did exist, you could make millions. Just hire more women and pay them less. It doesn't exist.
Senator Walsh, your response.
Again, I support the Fair Pay Wage Act so that women make just as much as a man does, and I'm going to continue to fight while I'm serving in the United States Senate to ensure that we continue to move forward with that. While serving as the Lieutenant Governor with Governor Bullock, we put together a commission to work on that right here in the state of Montana. So I'm confident that we are making headway here in Montana, and I will fight for that same fairness in the United States Senate.
And Congressman Daines, your response.
Well, it's, tell you what, it was served back in Washington. One thing we need to see more of in D.C. is more women leaders. We need more women elected to the United States Senate. We need more women elected to the United States Congress. I'm proud to work with some amazing women on both sides of the aisle in the United States Congress. We need to make sure we create opportunities so they are able to not only achieve great things in the workplace, but but also achieve great things in public service. And it's interesting, we got 3 men up here standing talking about this issue. I'd highly encourage getting more women engaged so we can see more women serving in the United States Congress, both in the Senate and the House.
The next question comes from Mike Dennison and goes to Senator Walsh.
Senator Walsh, you're the only Iraq war veteran in the U.S. Senate, yet I don't believe you've ever told us whether you think the war in Iraq was a good idea or has accomplished anything positive for our country or the Middle East. Has it? Was going to war in Iraq a good idea? And what should our Iraq and Middle East policy be going forward?
Well, Mike, you're right. I am the only one on the stage that has worn the uniform and served in the combat. Today, we only have 2 United States senators serving in the United States Senate who have served in combat, myself and Senator John McCain. I have the distinct pleasure of commanding the 1st of 163rd Infantry Battalion in Iraq in 2004 and 2005, where I took over 700 of Montana's finest young men and women with me into Iraq. It was a very difficult mission, but I'm proud of my service. I'm proud of the service that they did. The unit was awarded the Valorious Unit Citation for our accomplishments, so I am proud of the work that we did. You know, it was a very difficult mission, and I talk about that from the perspective of as I was traveling around the state of Montana, talking with families. My #1 priority was to make sure that we brought all 700 plus men and women home that I took over there with me. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. When we put our task force together from all over the country, I lost 4 soldiers. 1 from Montana, 1 from Oregon, 1 from Washington, 2 from Montana, I'm sorry, and 1 from Oregon and 1 from Washington. So, and several were injured. Another young man that I know quite well and I communicate with on a regular basis will live the rest of his life in a wheelchair because he's paralyzed below the waist. So the war in Iraq has cost this country greatly. The families that have been impacted, the cost to our government, the cost that we have put these wars on the credit card are outrageous. So I honestly do not believe that we should have sent our men and women, knowing what we know today, into Iraq.
Congressman Daines, your answer?
Well, the unfolding events that we're seeing in Iraq today are very, very concerning as we see these ISIS forces where you have the Islamic State of Iraq has now joined forces with the Islamic State of Syria. And so you have the ISIS, the Islamic State of Syria and Iraq that have joined forces here. And if you're watching the news breaking really every 24 hours, where they've now entered Mosul, which is the ancient city of Nineveh, moving south into Tikrit, and they're now knocking on the door of Baghdad. This is another example, I think, truly of the failed policies we've seen of the president who's leading from behind. And I don't believe we should commit boots on the ground in Iraq. But I do believe we need to be more proactive and get out in front of this because we have a tragic situation unfolding. And I too share the significant hurt of knowing that we had nearly 4,500 Americans who've lost their lives in Iraq, 28 Montanans who lost their lives in Iraq. And consequently, we want to make sure that we have policies in place here, but with good military objectives. #1, we have to have a clear objective. Why are we going in the first place? Is there a clear objective? And #2, is there overwhelming force being used? If you don't meet those 2 clear objectives, we have no business being and deploying troops overseas.
Mr. Roots, your answer?
Was going into Iraq a good idea? Absolutely not. We were lied to get into Iraq. It was a lie. We were told stories by the Bush administration about how there were weapons of mass destruction. It was a lie. We demonstrated that it was a lie. We were brought into Iraq under false pretenses. Even in the broader picture, this global war on terror is a lie. You know, the average American is more likely to die drowning in your bathtub than from a terrorist attack. You're more likely to die from a bee sting than from a terrorist attack. These 2 parties have built a totalitarian network of surveillance and of control with SWAT teams all over the world. Listen, tanks, bombs, missiles. We've spent $1 trillion in Iraq. We've achieved absolutely nothing. They've just taken the resources of the American people and they've funded these wonderful, General Dynamics, Raytheon, these great defense contractors. They've made millions off of the war in Iraq. The American people are impoverished by the war in Iraq. We need to not send any more of our resources into those theaters. We need to bring everything back home. We don't spend enough on defense. We spend nothing on defense. We spend way too much on offense. It's time to get the U.S. military carved back, close those bases, and bring them home.
Senator Walsh, your response?
You know, another thing that I'm very disappointed in the president in, he's talking about keeping 9,800 forces in Afghanistan for the next 5 to 10 years. Currently, we're paying approximately $1.2 million per soldier in Afghanistan to keep them there. Once if we drop below the 10,000 level and we keep them there for 5 to 10 more years, that cost will go up to $2.3 million per soldier. It's time to bring our soldiers home from Afghanistan, and we need to do it now. And that means all of our soldiers home from Afghanistan immediately.
Congressman Daines, your response?
So, John, I want to thank you for your service to our country as well, serving in Iraq. Thank you. I appreciate that, truly. I think it brings up another issue, though, that ties to this discussion, and that is the importance of driving towards American energy independence. We, within this next 10 years, have the ability, if we don't allow government to get in the way with regulations, to become energy independent and be a net energy exporter. Our allies over in Europe, when they saw that former KGB colonel named Putin going through Ukraine and Crimea, they were writing us saying, how quickly can you start moving liquid natural gas? Because 30% of the natural gas that comes through the Ukraine supplies Europe. So the faster we can get to a energy independent status in this country, the more secure the next generation is going to be.
And Mr. Roots, your response?
You know, there was a global poll about where they asked people all over the world. They went all over the world very recently. I think it was last fall. And they asked them, in your opinion, what is the most dangerous, what is the greatest source of danger in the world? Which country on earth is the most dangerous country on earth? Which is the greatest source of insecurity and instability in global affairs? Guess what it was? The United States won, going away. It wasn't even close. Second was Pakistan with like 5%. The people of the world, listen, we are drone killing with predator drones. We're flying over other countries. We're surveilling everybody's telecommunications, all in the name of keeping the United States safe from what? Terrorism? Again, you're more likely to die from a bee sting. You're more likely to die from a lightning strike than from terrorism. It's time to stop spending so much money.
The next question comes from Anna Rao and goes to Congressman Daines.
Representative Daines, despite the House's best efforts, Congress has been unable to repeal Obamacare. Even if Republicans gain control of the Senate in this election, Obama would certainly veto any repeal effort, and an override is highly unlikely. Given these political realities and the fact that millions of Americans and 36,000 Montanans have already signed up for the Affordable Care Act, what would you do about it? Would you continue to try and repeal it, or would you try to fix it?
Washington, D.C. centered solutions are usually not the right solution for Montana. We need to have a Montana-centered solution. When this legislation passed the House and the Senate and was signed into law by President Obama, you saw what happened across the country as the American people saw their premiums go up, they've seen their deductibles go up, and it's not solving the original problem, which is trying to provide better accessibility and affordability to health care. So what we need to do is we need to come up with a Montana-centered solution. We still have the problem, but we need to have a solution to that problem, and it needs to be a Montana-centered solution. Again, we don't need to have a one-size-fits-all federal takeover of the healthcare system in this country. States like Indiana have already moved forward here with some of their own ideas as they're looking at what they need to do to address the issues in Indiana. Similarly, in Montana, we have different challenges than in states like New York, Florida, California. So there's a couple of parts of that we should look at in terms of allowing young people to stay on their policies till they're 26 years old, dealing with pre-existing conditions. But we need to start focusing on allowing the patient to get back into the center of that equation, because the federal government has taken away freedom and liberty in health care by mandating what that choice needs to be.
Mr. Roots, your answer?
These two government supremacist parties have destroyed health care. They have listen, every one of these huge enactments, Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, they all have the same result. They increase demand without increasing supply, causing prices to rise. Healthcare prices have been rising faster than the rate of inflation every single year for 30 years. Obamacare just adds a little bit more to that. So as your U.S. Senator, I will work to repeal every single one of those, Medicare, Medicaid, even the requirements that, the prescription requirement is unnecessary. We shouldn't need to go to a doctor first and then go to the pharmacy. The pharmacist himself is highly educated. We need to eliminate and deregulate all of these things. We need to legalize drugs, legalize medications, make everything available over the counter. We would bring costs down. If we unleash the power of capitalism on healthcare, the poorest man in the world could stumble out from under his bridge, bleeding from 1,000 open sores. He could stumble into a roadside medical tent and be restored to full health for just $49.95. If we unleash the power of capitalism on healthcare, you could get a kidney transplant during your lunch break at Walmart and be back to work after lunch, and it would cost you about $69.95.
Senator Walsh, your answer?
Over the past 10 or 15 years, we have seen healthcare costs in this country continue to rise. And in some cases, it's unattainable for a lot of Montana families to obtain quality healthcare. So we need to make sure that we are moving towards a system that all of our citizens can receive quality, affordable healthcare. With regard to Obamacare, the jury is still out from my perspective. The president promised that we would see healthcare costs come down. He promised that if you liked your insurance company, you could keep it. He promised that if you liked your doctor, you could keep him. I'm hearing from Montanans that that's not the case. And so until I see the cost of healthcare come down in Montana, the jury is still out from my perspective. But the only plan that Congressman DAINES has come up with so far with regard to reforming healthcare is to privatize Medicare. What is privatizing Medicare going to do for the citizens of Montana? It's going to shift costs onto the backs of our seniors and raise costs on them several $1,000s. That's not the route that I want to take. I think we need to come together and come up with ideas in order to bring provide quality, affordable health care down for our citizens. My wife is a diabetic. She's been a diabetic for 43 years. We were always concerned that we would if I were to lose my job, she would not be able to maintain her health care. Now, she doesn't have to worry about that because pre-existing conditions are covered. Just like thousands of other Montanans. I have a son who's 24 years old who can stay on my health insurance until he's 26 years old. So those are a couple of good things. We need to continue to come up with ideas to move forward with providing quality, affordable health care for our citizens.
Congressman DAINES, your response?
John says the jury is still out. Well, I've got news. The Montana jury has rendered a verdict, and they don't like Obamacare. And this becomes a choice that we have to make. Are we going to stand with Barack Obama, or are we going to stand with the people of Montana? We need a Montana built and centered solution to address our health care costs, not one that comes from Senator Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Harry Reid.
Mr. Roots, your response?
I'd like to point to there are a couple areas of medical care in this country that are not paid for by any insurance plan and are not paid for by any government program of any kind. One of them is LASIK surgery. Another one is breast implant surgery, a lot of facelifts. These are things that you have to pay for out of your own pocket. And guess what? Prices have been going down in all of those areas where you have to pay out of your own pocket. LASIK surgery has been going down in cost and going up in quality. The same thing would happen if we unleashed the power of capitalism on every other part of the healthcare industry. Folks, we would live to be 100 years old, 200 years old. Life expectancy would skyrocket. We would heal this nation. We'd be the healthiest nation that ever existed in human history if we just had the guts to unleash the power of capitalism on healthcare.
Senator Walsh, your response?
Another area that we could save hundreds of millions of dollars in this country is if we had the ability to negotiate prescription drug prices. I visited a doctor's office in Missoula last week. He pulled out two vials like this. One of them, he says he pays about $2,200 for. Another one he pays $250 for. The $2,200 vial is the one that he has to use on Medicare patients. It's a requirement. If he had the option to use the same vial with the same medication in it to use on Medicare patients, he would save hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars right here in the state of Montana. If we allowed that across the country to negotiate prescription drug prices, we would save hundreds of millions of dollars right there.
The next question comes from Frank Mealy and goes to Mr. Roots.
Mr. Roots, our nation's libertarian streak would seem to argue against any kind of government interference in personal choices that don't have a moral dimension. However, morality has played a significant role in legislation in the past 2 centuries. Today's political climate seems to be saying that society has no overarching moral interest in such matters as drug use, abortion, marriage, but it does have a moral interest in health care, education, and the minimum wage. Do you believe that state or federal majorities should have a right to legislate on any issues that control other people's behavior, and specifically how?
I do not. I do not believe that government should be involved in any of those areas you mentioned. All of those areas would improve. Our health would improve. Everything about human life would improve. Remember when the Berlin Wall came down? Listen, it was more polluted. The government supremacists claim that you need government to, government's better for the environment. All evidence shows otherwise. In Korea, the average South Korean is actually taller. Did you know that? The average South Korean, after 50 years of that split, and remember they were the same exact society just 50 years ago, the average South Korean is taller than the average North Korean. Their stature, their nutrition is better than the North Koreans. Every time you unleash central planning and socialism on a human problem, you get more problems. Every time you unleash the power of the individual human spirit, you heal, you cure problems. And if we just had the courage to do nothing about so many of these things, we have to have the courage to do nothing. I know it sounds unusual, but if we had the courage to do nothing, you would see the human predicament in this world flower and blossom with abundance and prosperity. We would reach the stars. Instead, these 2 government supremacist parties keep taking us down the road towards slave plantation ideology and government control.
Senator Walsh, your answer?
You know, this is an area where Congressman Daines and I disagree. Congressman Daines believes in overturning Roe v. Wade, which would allow the government to get involved in the decisions regarding a woman's health care. I do not believe that the government should be involved in a woman's health care decision. I do not believe the government should be involved in our bedrooms. I do not believe the government should be putting mandates on individuals here in Montana. So I think that we need to take a step back and keep the government out of our individual lives. You know, one of the first bills that I introduced when I went back to Washington, D.C. was the Civil Liberties Protection Act, because the government has the ability right now to obtain phone data on everybody in this room. So what my bill will do will require the government to get a warrant through the FISA courts to obtain this information. You know, Congressman Daines signed on to legislation just last week that would allow companies to share our data with the government. I think that's wrong.
Congressman Daines?
So it's another important question about, are we going to stand when you're leading and serving back in Washington with Barack Obama and the federal government, or are you going to stand with the people of Montana? These kinds of decisions need to be left to the states. We should not have the federal government overturning what Montanans might decide on these important issues. So I'm going to stand with Montana. I'm going to respect what Montanans choose on this. We don't want the federal government overturning what Montanans have already decided we believe is right to do in our state. It's so important that we allow the states to have primacy in so many areas in this country, whether in some of these issues we just were described, or also in regulations. We don't need to have this overarching, overbearing, overreaching federal government intruding on our way of life out here in Montana.
Mr. Roots, your response?
I'd like to discuss an area that libertarians sometimes disagree with each other on, and that is abortion. It's one of those areas where occasionally you will find libertarians, even at the Libertarian National Convention, who will take a pro-life position, and they will say, well, they do that because abortion is murder, and therefore it's not really any different than enforcing laws against murder. My response to that is this: whenever you ask a politician who claims he's pro-life and who claims he believes abortion is murder, whenever you ask him, well, what should the penalty be for having an abortion? You know what their response is? They'd do anything not to answer the question. If they say anything other than life imprisonment or the death penalty, they don't really believe abortion is murder. Okay, because if abortion is murder, it would have to be first-degree murder. We all agree on that. It's premeditated. So if they say anything other, I constantly am in arguments with some good friends of mine on this issue. Most of my friends disagree with me on this. They call themselves pro-life, and they say that they believe abortion is murder. Again, if you say anything other than
Mr.
the death
Roots,
penalty
your
or
time
life
is up.
imprisonment, you don't really believe that.
Senator Walsh, your response?
You know, Congressman Daines, again, talks about shifting the burden from the federal government to the state government. I don't believe that the state government should be involved in making women's health care decisions. I don't believe the state government should be involved in making decisions what happens in mine and my wife's bedroom. So the state government shouldn't be putting mandates out on the citizens of Montana either.
Congressman Daines, your response?
Yeah, one of the, it's very important as we look at these issues that we stand to protect the most vulnerable in our society. And the most vulnerable include the disabled, they include the elderly, they also include the unborn. And so I will continue to fight for fundamental rights, the Declaration of Independence. In fact, they call them unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
We have time for some more questions. So the next question, could you hold your pause, please, will be from Anna Rao, and we'll go to Senator Walsh.
Senator Walsh, in the wake of the scandals at the Veterans Administration, the Senate has passed a bill allowing for more doctor hiring and for veterans to seek care outside the VA if the wait times are too long. Do you support the concept of the VA as a government-run healthcare system, and if so, how would you fix it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm appalled of the problems that our VA system is having to provide health care for our men and women who have served this country. We have, here in the state of Montana, over 100,000 veterans who are willing to sign their name on the line and give their life for this country. And when they come home, they should be awarded or receive the health care that they deserve. So I'm appalled that the VA, the President, the Congress, Veterans Affairs have failed the men and women who have served this country. You know, Congressman Daines doesn't understand that we've had over 2 million men and women have deployed to Iraq and Afghanistan. He had the opportunity to provide the funding, additional funding that was needed to help the VA system out. Congressman Daines voted no on a bipartisan budget agreement, and he voted no because it didn't cut far enough. If he wanted it to cut far enough, that would have cut even additional funds out of the VA system. You know, just this week, the Senate passed a bill that is going to allow our veterans to seek care in the private sector. I support that, but there's a piece of in that legislation that I provided in there, and it's going to have a committee that is put together from outside of the Department of Veterans Affairs that will look at the problems within the VA. Changing the Secretary of the VA is not going to solve the problem. It's a big bureaucracy. We need to take a look at how we can solve these problems so that the men and women who have served this country, the men and women who are willing to put their lives on this line for this country, receive the health care that they deserve.
Congressman Daines, your answer?
So I travel around the state. Recently, I was in Helena meeting with a group of veterans. He was a Vietnam veteran, had been exposed to Agent Orange. They found a spot on his lung. They did a CAT scan on it. And the VA said, they read the CAT scan. In January, they found the spot. They said, can you come back in September for your next appointment? When I heard stories like that, I said, it is time to change up what's going on in Washington. I was one of the first members on in either the House or the Senate that called for Secretary Shinseki resignation. I got out in front of that. That's what leadership's about. John called for the Secretary's resignation the day before he actually resigned. That was 3 weeks later. Then we moved on action, and I agree that it's more than just taking out the leadership and changing it. As a son of a Marine, leadership starts at the top. Then we passed 2 bills in the House, the VA Accountability Act, which says we should not be allowing the VA executives to get these bonuses while veterans are dying right now waiting for care across this country. Number 2, we passed a bill that said if a veteran lives 40 miles or more away from a facility, they can go to another facility closer to them at VA expense. They can choose. It gives the veteran choice. And second, if the appointment is scheduled beyond 14 days, they can go to another facility so they get immediate care. That's action, that's leadership to take care of this outrageous situation going on in the VA.
Mr. Roots, your answer?
The VA system is socialized health care, and it's indicative of what happens to socialized health care whenever you create it. And that's true all over the world. I often have conversations with people who point to some place and they tell me, well, that's great health care over there, some other country. Great system over there. And they frequently point to one of the wealthier Western countries, France sometimes. They'll point to Canada sometimes. But when you go and look at what really happens there, you find that, well, it's actually more expensive. There are wait times. You've got to stand in line. Everything is not as good as it has been pointed out to be. And by the way, those are the best systems. Go to the worst systems. Virtually every country in the world has some kind of socialized health care. North Korea has socialized health care. There are horrible systems out there. The VA, by the way, I believe the budget of the VA has tripled. How many of you knew that the Veterans Administration Department is, I believe, the second largest department in the federal government by spending? We are spending so much on that. It's unbelievable what is spent, and it's tripled in just a few recent years. And it's indicative of what happens when you put government in charge of health care. If we unleash the power of capitalism on health care, we'd live to be 300 years old.
Senator Walsh, a response?
Well, a couple things. The legislation that was passed in the United States Senate this week was passed by bipartisan support. Members from both sides of the aisle coming together. And I'm proud to be part of that, bringing people together to solve a problem for our veterans. Like I mentioned earlier, there's only 2 veterans serving in the United States Senate, myself and Senator John McCain. And one of the reasons that this bill passed, because there was a veteran in the United States Senate pushing for this type of action, that we look out for our veterans in the Senate. So another piece of legislation that I've introduced is the Suicide Prevention Act for America's veterans. Today, we're losing 22 veterans a day to suicide because we don't have enough health care providers to deal with the PTSD and the issues that are coming back, when our soldiers are coming back. And in the Senate, that has bipartisan support. Both Democrats and Republicans are on board to support that piece of legislation. But the one person who hasn't signed on to support that legislation is our own Congressman Steve DAINES. So I would ask Steve to support that piece of legislation.
Congressman Daines, your response?
You know, I was visiting with the MP unit getting ready to deploy out of Belgrade. It was going to be one of the last missions there over to Afghanistan earlier this year. And I voted against the Ryan Murray budget. I'll tell you why. Because it worked to balance the budget on the backs of veteran pensions. John supported that. And these veterans came to me and said, Steve, how can Congress work to balance the budget here on the backs of veteran pensions? I said, that's unacceptable. I voted no. And we got that fixed. We got that fixed about 3 weeks later. So I'm always going to stand with veterans. As a son of a veteran, Dad taught me of service and sacrifice, and also the importance of making sure we keep our promises to our veterans.
Mr. Roots, your response?
I would just point out, any of you who want to read up on the Veterans Hospital situation, there are certain things where they can argue they were the first to do an open heart transplant. The Veterans Hospitals, remember, there are many of them, and so they have several claims that they did this or that thing first. There's a few pioneering things that they did, but compared to what would have happened if that same system was privatized, if we had the private sector working on that, it's not even close. The private sector would come in, do things much cheaper. You'd see people heal faster. You'd see all kinds of innovation and invention. We'd be so healthy we wouldn't know what to do with ourselves. We'd be as fit as Lance Armstrong. We'd be walking around built like Arnold Schwarzenegger.
We'll have one more question. It will come from Frank Mealy, and the candidates will be given 90 seconds for an answer only. There will be no response. Frank?
Representative Daines, a lot of politicians who benefit from campaign spending say that campaign spending is a major threat to our country. Some Democrats have proposed to amend the First Amendment to give Congress the authority to regulate campaign spending. What is your reaction?
The Supreme Court holds the First Amendment in very high esteem, as they should. They've had several rulings that ensure that First Amendment rights are protected. And as I see what's going on across this country with the IRS has, because of people's political persuasions, has discriminated against them. In fact, you've seen the news in the last 48 hours. Lois Lerner now has lost 2 years' worth of email because her computer crashed. This is one of the challenges we face with big government getting involved in our lives. And that is why we must continue to fight for more jobs and less government on every front, including these regulations that relates to the IRS. I think most Montanans agree there's too much money in politics, but we also need to balance that with protecting the very important rights of free speech and the First Amendment. I would say this, and you're going to hear something probably from John on this as it relates to campaign finance reform and some other issues. Just 3 weeks ago, Tom Steyer, the vocal opponent of the Keystone Pipeline, of coal, of natural resources, a billionaire from San Francisco, holds an event, and then they hold an event for John. It was Joe Biden in Nancy Pelosi's district charging $10,000 to $30,000 a ticket. So I want to hear consistency from John on this issue.
Mr. Roots, an answer?
I think it is a national disgrace that both of Montana's U.S. senators are formally seeking to amend the Constitution to limit the protections of the First Amendment. How many of you knew that government needed even more power? Our 2 sitting U.S. senators, Tester and Walsh, are both seeking to give the government even more power than it has right now over what they call campaign spending, or what I call political speech. The Citizens United case, by the way, who could argue against saying that you can't ban books and videos? The government actually argued in that case that it had the authority to ban books and videos if even a single line in those books or videos called for the election of a candidate. Who could say that that decision is some radical decision where the U.S. Supreme Court, at least the majority, thankfully, it should have been unanimous, said, no, you're not going to ban books in America. We have a First Amendment. Okay, they say that spending is not, money is not speech. Folks, regulating and controlling the money and the resources behind speech and flyers and pamphlets is one of the most direct ways of chilling and controlling speech. So these people would control so much about politics. They would have McCarthyite hearings. You would be asked, did you write this pamphlet? Who's your donor? All the founding fathers, by the way, used alias names and pseudonyms because they were afraid of the government when they criticized the government.
Mr. Roots. Mr. Walsh, your answer?
Well, I do support campaign finance reform in this country. I do not believe that corporations are people. I still recall that July 1st of 2004, when over 700 of Montana's finest men and women were lining up to get onto an airplane to go to Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't recall seeing any corporations in line to get on and go with us. So I think that we do need to overturn the Citizens United decision, but you know who doesn't think we should overturn the Citizens United decision? Congressman Steve Daines. I can tell you, from the day that I entered this race, Congressman Daines and his outside friends have been coming into the state of Montana to swift boat my military career. A 33-year military career that I am so proud of, that I took 700 of Montana's finest young men and women into Iraq. I brought men home that fought so hard on behalf of the citizens of this state. So corporations shouldn't be making decisions on behalf of the citizens of Montana.
Okay. We'll now move directly to the closing remarks, and we start with Senator Walsh. You have 3 minutes.
Well, thank you very much. I again want to thank all of you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be here. I want to thank the staff of Montana Tech for allowing us to use this facility. Thank our moderators. You know, when I entered into this race, I entered into the race because Washington is broken. Washington has a spending problem, and our congressman is part of that problem. I want to go back to Washington, D.C. to be part of the solution. In the military, we have a mission to accomplish. We don't accomplish that mission based on whether or not the course of action was developed by a Democrat or a Republican. We accomplish that mission based on what's the best course of action, who has the best ideas to solve the problems. And that's what I want to go to Washington, D.C. to do. We are very fortunate in Montana to have some quality men and women who have served in the United States Senate. Senators like Mike Mansfield, Lee Metcalf. They were true true statesmen. Those are the type of leaders that we need back in Washington, D.C. Men and women that have the courage to do what's right, even when the consequences are hard. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a granddaughter. She's about 1 year old. She is 1 year old. I want to make sure that the life that she has here in Montana is better than the life that I had here in Montana. But we've got to get on the right track. We can't cut spending on the backs of our most vulnerable citizens, our seniors who've been working hard, paying into Medicare, paying into their Social Security. We can't privatize Social Security. We can't make Medicare into a voucher system. Our seniors have been paying into these programs, and they've been working hard. They deserve these programs, and we need to make sure that those programs are shored up for future generations. So I can tell you what, if you want someone who's going to go to Washington, D.C., work on behalf of the citizens of Montana to solve problems, come up with solutions, then I would ask for your vote. If you want somebody to go to Washington, D.C. who's going to be an obstructionist and not vote yes on anything, then I'm not your man. I'm going to Washington, D.C. to get things done on the behalf of the citizens of Montana. Thank you.
Congressman Daines, your closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you so much for being here today, and to our panelists, our moderator, and for the participants as well. You know, when you sum it all up, there's a pretty clear contrast, because elections are always about differences and about contrasts. I'm standing for more jobs. I'm standing for less government. John is standing for more government. We saw that just today when he said about his support for Obamacare. We hear that about his support for these regulatory groups, going to anti-coal rallies and so forth, that are supporting these regulatory groups that want to impose their will on the people of Montana, killing jobs. I stand as somebody who wants more jobs, and we want less government. That's because I spent 28 years in business. I was actually out there doing it for many, many years, creating jobs and opportunities for many, many Montanans, hundreds of Montanans right there in my hometown of Bozeman. And at the end of the day, you make a choice when you serve back in Washington. Are you going to stand with the people that elected to serve you? Are you going to stand with Montanans? Or are you going to stand with Harry Reid and Barack Obama? The Senate is broken. We need a new United States Senate. We've passed over 260 bills in the House that Harry Reid tables and does not allow a vote on the Senate floor. So we need a change in who leads the Senate, the leadership. We need a change in direction in this country. This president has launched a war on the middle class. It was very interesting as I chat with union members across the state, with tribal leaders across the state. They are seeing the effects now of the overreaching federal regulations that are directly affecting middle-class Montanans here, hard-working taxpayers who want a better life for their kids. You know, 5 generations ago, my great-great-grandma came to America. She was an immigrant from Norway, and she homesteaded just north of Great Falls. She's buried just east of Conrad. She came, she had 7 children, she was a widow, and she came for freedom. She came for opportunity. She came for a better way of life for her children. And now, Cindy and I, as parents of 4 children, see a very stark choice in this country. Are we going to stand for freedom, for opportunity, for Montana? We're going to stand for bigger government, fewer jobs, less freedom, and less opportunity, because that's what's at stake for our kids and our grandkids. We have a heritage we're very, very proud of here in Montana, a heritage of public lands, of the outdoors, of the Second Amendment, and these rights are being infringed on right now by this explosive federal government and this overreach of this president in Harry Reid in the United States Senate. So I'm glad and grateful to be able to serve as United States Congressman, and I would ask for your support to serve you in the United States Senate.
Mr. Roots, your closing remarks.
There has never been a good government in world history, and there never will be a good government, because good government is impossible. The Founding Fathers well understood this. By the way, if any of you know of a good government in world history that ever existed anywhere in the world, you'll have to let me know where that ever occurred. The Libertarian Party used to have a presidential candidate named Harry Brown. Harry Brown used to tour the entire country, and he would ask audiences, can any of you name a single federal agency that actually accomplishes its stated goals? Its stated goals. No one could ever come up with a single agency or program that actually accomplishes its stated goals. Finally, he said, a woman in one town said, well, what about the Weather Bureau? Everybody had a nice chuckle, a giggle over it, but that actually shows the weather, keep in mind, the Weather Bureau is actually very expensive compared to the private sector alternatives, such as the Weather Channel. The Weather Channel is a private company. It produces better content, more entertaining content, better information, and it's much, 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 much cheaper, and it's voluntary. You don't even have to pay for it if you don't want to. And that's true all the way across the board. There's never been a good government agency. There's never been a good government program. These parties have ruined America. These parties have put so much government into our lives. Listen, a vote for one is as good as a vote for the other. You'll get the same result. Again, we've been sending Republicans, we've been sending Democrats out of Montana to Washington for years. I've watched this for years. We've had Republican politicians who've claimed that they would cut spending. They went and grew spending. There's never been one who cut spending, as far as I know, ever from Montana. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you know of one, you'll have to let me know. Jesse Ventura sometimes compared the Democrats and the Republicans to the gang members in LA, the Crips and the Bloods. You know, the Crips and the Bloods hate each other's guts. And if one of them sees one of the other gang members on the streets, they may cross the street to physically and violently attack the member of the other gang. And you'll see that among Democrats and Republicans. I occasionally come across either Democrats or Republicans who hate the other government supremacist party. It's part of sort of tribalism. There's something instinctual about it. But those of us who are on the outside looking in, we say, you know, they're really not that much different. And by the way, the current budget that was hammered out, the current federal budget right now that was hammered out between Paul Ryan, Republican in the House, Patty Murray, the Democrat in the Senate, we don't know all the details because it was hammered out in secret, but those two parties began negotiating, from what we know, within 1% of each other. I urge you to vote Libertarian in this election. Thank you so much.
And thank you. With that, that concludes our debate. I want to thank the candidates, Senator Walsh, Congressman Daines, and Mr. Roots, for your frank answers. I want to thank our panelists, Anna Rao, Frank Mealy, and Mike Dennison. Especially want to thank our timers for keeping us on track, and the production team from Montana PBS. It's been great being able to work with them. The Montana Newspaper Association for helping to sponsor this debate. And you, the viewers and the audience makers, will hopefully gain some information during this debate that helps you make a better informed decision in the voting booth. And so good night from the Library of Montana Tech.
This Montana PBS presentation of the Montana Newspaper Association Candidate Debates was brought to you in part by the Greater Montana Foundation, encouraging communications on issues, trends, and values of importance to Montanans, and the Montana Newspaper Foundation.